Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Cilla Travis, back with another tutorial. So this is a continuation of my previous tutorial on how to draft a bodice with a yoke. So my intention is to turn this pattern into a peplum top. So this top is going to have a 360-degree peplum, which means a full circle skirt peplum. I've already cut out my peplum and sewn it together with lining and crinoline. And this piece right here is what I'm going to use to design the peplum. Now for the other piece, I wanted to use it, but I changed my mind. Now for the sleeve, the pattern I'm using for the sleeve is the sleeve pattern for stretchy fabric. So I'm going to leave a link on how to draft a sleeve pattern for stretchy fabric, okay? Now I've cut my yoke on the same net fabric I'm using for the sleeve, which is stretchy. Now the main net fabric has a beautiful sequence design on it, and I also went ahead to cut a lining for the yoke. Now the lining I use for the yoke is a plain net which has stretch as well, but it has no design, it is just plain. So cutting out a lining for the yoke is going to help give the neckline of the yoke a very clean finishing. So right now go ahead and open up the pattern so you see what I have. So you want to cut your front piece including the yoke on fold, and the back piece I cut 2 pieces, and I also cut 2 pieces for the yoke itself. Went ahead to copy my dart onto the back piece as well as the front piece. Now for the front piece, I added fusible interfacing all over, and I later on went ahead to add soft wadding from the chest to the underbust of the front pattern. Okay, so right now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and join them together. Now when sewing the dart on the front piece, you know, because we have both the bust dart and the waist dart meshed into one, I said you should come down with 5/8 of an inch, okay, which is pretty standard, especially when you're merging your front darts, your bust dart and your waist dart together, okay? But coming down 5/8 of an inch didn't really work well for me, because after sewing it, the bust dart was too pointy, so I had to go upward almost to the actual bust point to smoothen this out just to get the accurate fit on the bust point that's needed. So do pay attention to this if you're going to have one dart on your front piece. If you don't want to go through the stress, instead of having one dart, you can have 2 darts, or turn the dart into a princess seam or a pleat or whatever you desire. Alright guys, let's start sewing. So one great tip I find really helpful when sewing a straight dart is to first fold your fabric along the center line of the dart and give it a good press with your pressing iron. You know, this really helps to sew the dart quickly and easily, okay? So now I'm going to take this to my ironing table and give this a good press. Now you want to press your dart toward the center front, that is for the front piece, and you want to press the back dart toward the center back for the back piece, okay? So remember this, the back dart should be pressed toward the center back, while the front dart should be pressed toward the center front. Now it's time to sew the yoke. First, I'm going to place the lining piece, that is the right side of the lining, onto the right side of the main piece. And at this point, I'm going to cut out the zip allowance from this portion of the neckline because I'm going to be adding a loop and a button, so we really don't need the zip allowance anymore, okay? Now to sew the keyhole at the back piece, I'm going to sew it with 1/4 of an inch, as I did not add seam allowance around the keyhole when cutting out the pattern. So this will make my keyhole width a total of 5 inches wide on the whole back piece. Now after sewing, I'm going to trim the seam allowance just a little bit, and then I'm going to use this loop turning to just turn it over to the right side. Now for the second part of the yoke, you want to leave an opening at the center back, okay? So for the second part of the yoke, while the yoke is still on the wrong side, I'm going to slip my loop through the tiny opening on the center back, and then I'm going to sew with 1/4 of an inch. And please guys, remember to take note of the size of your loop just to make sure it fits the size of your button before sewing, okay? Now to sew the front yoke, carefully place the right side of your lining piece on the main piece, and then go ahead and sew the neckline. You know, it is best to pin this in place before you start sewing, especially if you are a beginner, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and sew the neckline of the front yoke. Now I'm going to trim off a little bit of the seam allowance, and then I'm going to take the yoke to my table and give it a good press. So one tip here, when pressing the yoke, you want to first of all place a wet cloth on top of the yoke before using your pressing iron, and you want to focus more on the neckline, okay? So right now I've given my bodice a good press, and like I said, you want to press your front dart toward the center front, and you want your back dart pressed toward the center back, okay? So now we're going to move forward and attach the yoke to the rest part of the bodice. And guys, I will be honest here. I just have to be honest here. When it comes to sewing a sweetheart neckline, especially when you need to attach a yoke, this part is really tricky and challenging to sew. And no matter how many times I've done this, it stresses me out each time. As a beginner, you might want to skip the sweetheart neckline and go for something straight or a smooth curve instead. But the truth is that you would never get to learn how to sew the sweetheart neckline if you don't start practicing now, okay? So you might want to take your time with these and, you know, give it a try. Now I'm going to start pinning the yoke to the neckline of the bottom piece, starting from the center, then I'm going to work my way to each side. So you want to really take your time and make sure you're doing this the right way, okay? Because any little error is going to show, okay? So take your time when doing this. So once this is done, I'm going to do the same thing for the back piece, okay? So the back piece is not as challenging as the front because there is a center back cut. So now I'm going to go ahead and pin this in place and then take this to the sewing machine and join them together. So for the back yoke, when sewing the yoke to the back piece, you want to align the yoke exactly the way it is on your pattern. So my back yoke ends just where my zip allowance begins. So what I'm going to do is to align my yoke to make sure it ends where the zip allowance begins, okay? All right, guys, finally we've done it. The yoke is done. So one tip here is that once the neckline is sewn, you need to cut a snip right in the middle of the neckline. So make sure you don't cut through the stitch, okay? So cutting a snip is going to make the neckline relax a bit, and to make it even relax more, you're going to first follow the same process and fix your lining, okay? So I would advise you, first of all, fix your lining. And once this is done, you want to turn your seam allowance toward the lining and do a top stitch on the right side of the lining, okay? So guys, let me go do this and come back to show you what it looks like. So a great tip here when attaching your lining, first you want to sew the lining before you place a snip right on the center front of the neckline. So what I've done here after attaching the lining is that I trimmed off the seam allowance to about 1/4 of an inch, and then I did a top stitch, and then I pressed it with my pressing iron to make it relaxed. Next, I'm going to join the front and the back on the shoulder seam. So you can just take the front and the back and join it the straightforward way, but because I don't want my seam allowance to be out, I'm going to open up the shoulder seam at the front and at the back and merge it together just by the neckline and then sew it together. So once this is sewn together, I'm going to flip it to the right side. So this is going to close up that seam allowance. Now to sew the side seam, I'm going to sew the lining and the fabric separately. So I'm going to mesh the right side of the front onto the right side of the back and then sew it with 1/2 of an inch, which is the seam allowance I added to my pattern. And then I'm going to sew the right side of the front lining onto the right side of the back lining, and then you're going to have something like this, okay? So at this point, I'm going to give the top a good press. And one great tip here to get a clean finishing when you sew is to always iron your seam as you go. So you want to press as you go. You don't want to wait until you finish sewing the whole piece before you do this. So as you sew, you want to press the seam open. Okay, now it's time to attach the peplum to the bodice. First, I'm going to place the right side of the peplum onto the right side of the top, like so. I'm going to start pinning from the center point of the peplum to the center point of the top, and then work my way to each side of the top until it gets to the center back, okay? So right now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and join them together. As I'm joining, I'm going to add my designing piece onto the peplum, okay? So once the peplum is sewn, I'm going to go ahead and fix my sleeve. Now that I'm done fixing the sleeve and the peplum, I'm going to go ahead and use my serger to finish the raw seam of the waist and also the armhole seam, okay? So if you don't have a serger, you can use a bias to cover up the waist seam or the armhole, or you can use a zigzag stitch to finish it. And yeah, this is what the top looks like. It came out perfect. It came out clean. It is nice. And I'm loving every bit of it. the fit is perfect because I've mastered it. Okay, I understand my pattern, so the fit came out beautiful. Well guys, I hope you find this video helpful. If you do, you know what to do. Leave a comment, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with your friends. Okay, you have any question, feel free to leave it on the comment section. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.